Alright guys, welcome back to the shop. So we're finally going to be getting around to cutting the mortises into our headboard and footboard legs so that we can mount up these side rails. And from there we'll actually be on a pretty good roll with this project and starting to get things together. And so we've already got all of our mortises laid out here. We did that in the last video where we worked on the bed frame here. So now all we have to do is go in here and clear out that material. So we're going to be using a combination of the router to clear out the majority of the material. Then we're going to be going back in with some chisels to actually square these up all nicely. And the goal here is to try and cut out a perfectly squared up mortise so that when we actually go to fit up our tenons that are on our side rails, everything should go together as cleanly as possible. The only thing I really have to be careful of here is to not let the bit go crazy, because obviously we only have a 3/8 sidewall on either side, and on our vertical we only have a 1/2 inch. So if that router does go crazy, we're probably going to end up having to remake our piece of wood, which we don't want to have to do because that's expensive. I'm still not quite sure which router I want to use, so I'm going to experiment a little bit, because the palm router is, it's nice and small, lets me make nice small passes. Whereas if I use the plunge base on my bigger router, that might make it easier to actually hog out this much material. So there's pros and cons of both, so we're going to have to see which one is actually better than the other. And so actually saying that out loud, it might be a great idea to just use our old mortise cutting jig for my plunge router. So basically all it is just a sheet of acrylic that mounts onto the bottom of the plunge base of my Bosch router, and then it's got these two chunks of white oak that have nice straight edges on them, and then we just set this as our left and right stop points. So because these mortises are 1 inch wide, we can easily plunge in with our 1/2 inch router bit, clear out our material, and as long as we set this up properly to go from the left to the right of the board, we should get pretty good accurate mortises every single time, and it should be pretty much foolproof. Alright, so a minor modification had to be made. I just had to widen the slot on one side so we could actually reach the edge. Obviously, I didn't design this jig around these 4-inch pieces here, but that is the nice thing about a shop-made jig, is that they can be adjusted pretty easily. All I did was just drill a new hole, cut it out with the coping saw, and now we're good to go. So now the next thing we have to do is set our depth before we can actually start to cut. And so if you think back to when we did our tenons, we cut them to be 1 3/8 of an inch long, but we also had that taper to the end grain because circular saws suck. And so we have to account for that when we cut these holes. Now I also said in that video that I usually leave a little bit of excess room just for a glue squeeze out, material to build up, that kind of stuff, because you never want that end grain face of your tenon to butt up right against the inside of the mortise there. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be taking a 1-inch setup block, a 3/8 setup block, and then a 3/32 setup block. Now the 3/32, you could go with 1/8, you could go with a 16th if you want, just because I know that my worst case scenario tenon that I have on those side rails goes a 16th over. I want to make sure that I have at least a 32nd of an inch clearance after that one. And so now with just kind of a delicate balancing act, I've got the router zeroed, so the bit is sitting right on the top of the piece of wood here. All I have to do is just lift this gauge up, pinch down, hopefully hard, and then lock it in place. There's way better ways you can set this up, but this should work for my need. Alright, so we have our first leg mounted to the side rail, and it is looking good. So the fit here is actually perfect. I dialed it in with some 120 grit on a stick. So this is just some adhesive back sandpaper. This is like porter cable stuff. And I just put it on the stick, which gave me a nice flat reference surface to then, go across here with a little bit of a nicer medium. And so our fit on here now, as you can see, I don't need any tools, I don't need a mallet or anything to get this on and off. I can put it on and take it off just using my hands. Because we're gonna have these big rails and this is gonna be a giant bed frame, and this is going to somebody who is not a woodworker, I don't want them to have to specifically have a wood mallet and a piece of MDF so they can hammer this thing together every time they need to disassemble it. A bed frame you should be able to put together with minimal amount of tools. Now it is tight enough that we do have to slap it and hit it around a little bit, but it does line up perfectly. We do still have some work to do on our shoulder, but I'm gonna wait to do that once we get these boards all cleaned up. Because right now we have all these rough milling marks on the back side of this board, which is the outside face, right around that grain there, right around that edge there. We do have a decent amount of broken out fiber, so it's really hard to tell what is not lining up here, where we need to make some adjustments. So now that we have the tenons actually fitting up into this leg piece, now we can actually go through and finish off the rest of this board here. Obviously, once we get the rest of these legs fitted up. And so I think the funniest thing about this whole project is just how much perspective skews, your perception, I think. When we laid out these tenons just with pencil lines, they seemed way too small. When I actually cut the tenons, they seem pretty good, they seem like a pretty decent sized tenon, but they still, I still kind of have this gut feeling that they just seem a little bit small. But now that we've cut the mortise seems absolutely massive. So I think it really is just a case of perspective. When you take these small tenons, the amount of solid wood we have here and we're turning it into that much of a tenon, it doesn't seem like it would be a strong point of the board, or it would be strong enough to support the rest of the board. But then when you cut the mortises into the piece that is actually going to be supporting this board, they seem pretty freaking massive. So if you're cutting mortises like I'm doing here with the router, take the time to set up stop blocks at the front and the back of the cut. Because these are almost 1.5 inches deep, by the time the bit's down there, the collet is almost touching the wood here. So it's impossible to see what's happening at the end of the cut here. On this side, I can kind of see it, but when I get to the far side, I can't see it. And so what happens if you're plunged fully, that full 1.5 inches deep into this mortise here, and that bit contacts that back wall where you haven't cut into before, that router is going to go crazy. It's going to do all kinds of bad things to your router. It's going to mess up your workpiece. All you have to do, clamp a piece of wood back there to stop your router from going any further than what you've already cut before. Plus, when you have those stop blocks in place, it means that you just have to run around with the router. You don't have to slow down and take your time and look there. You just set up those stop blocks, run around with the router, and you're done. So make sure you set up stop blocks on the other side, and it'll make your life so much easier. Alright, so now we got all of our legs mostly fitted up. Some of them are not absolutely perfect just yet, but we want to wait and do all that final adjustments until we've got these side rails all cleaned up, because we are going to be making some minor changes there. And once we get all that stuff cleaned up, then we can then refine the shoulders of those tenons to make sure that everything seats up nicely. So the one thing that is important to mention here though is that when I was sizing up these tenons, I mainly took material off the backside or the inside of these side rails so that the rails would move in away from this edge here. Because worst case scenarios, if I remove material from both sides equally, or I moved more from the outside or front side of those tenons, then our big side stretcher would be proud of this surface here. So that means we'd have to bring that side stretcher down to meet this. Whereas the way that I have it now, all I have to do is just clean up this surface with the hand plane until it goes nice and flush with our side rails. So that's why mainly when you saw me taking off the bulk of the material from those tenons, it was on the back side of the board, not on the front side of the board. So it's really important to know, which side you're taking material off of, because it will affect the way that your joint works. And so now we can move on to actually installing our bolts. Now I am kind of having second thoughts here because I only bought 4-inch bolts, and I don't know if they're going to protrude far enough into our side rails here to actually have enough holding power. So what we're going to do is we're going to drill the holes in the legs, because no matter what I go with, it's going to be the exact same holes in the leg pieces, and we'll just have to see before we install the nut into our side rails here if these can actually reach, because that's going to be the most important thing. If that nut that I'm going to install into the side rails here doesn't seem like it's going to be far enough in to actually have holding power, then we'll have to figure out something else here. But for now, it's actually pretty easy, because all we need to do on our legs is drill 2 holes. So we're going to start by drilling a 1.5-inch hole with a Forstner bit, and what this will do is this will inset our nut below the surface of that wood. We want to make sure that this bolt is inside that leg, because then what we're going to do when it's all said and done, we're going to turn a little cap on the lathe that'll fit right into that hole, and then we'll flush it up, make sure you have a little pry spot so you can get a screwdriver in there, and that'll be what hides our bolts. And so now all we have to figure out is how far in we want our bolt and washer. So I know that because we're going to be doing that plug, we want that plug at least 1/4 inch thick. So we set our bolt about 1/4 inch in. We still got a ton of material on the backside here. We still easily have, a full 1.5 inches. So we could probably even go in 1/2 inch. Then we can make our plug a lot thicker, a little bit heavier duty. Then we only have to drill in about 7/8 of an inch with our Forstner bit. Then we have a whole other 7/8 of material on the backside here that's actually being pulled again. So that's going to be plenty strong, and I think that's what we're going to do. So one of the things you want to check before you go through all your drilling process here is what size hole you can actually get away with. So on this offcut here, I just drilled a 1/2 inch hole with my brad point bit, just because I didn't think that was actually going to work. Since this is a 1/2 inch bolt, I didn't think that a 1/2 inch bolt would fit inside a 1/2 inch hole. I thought I would have to go for a bigger drill bit, but when I put it together, that is a perfect fit. So obviously these bolts are just slightly undersized in order to fit into a 1/2 inch hole. So that'll be even better, because now you can see our bolt has no slop and no play to it. So it's even better than going up a size, because now I know that that bolt is going to lock in place and hold nice and firmly. It's going to be a very solid connection point. There's not going to be any slop to it. Okay, so we've got everything set up. We've got our holes drilled into our legs, and now we need to drill the holes into our actual side rails here. Now it's really important that these holes are going straight into our side rails here. So luckily, with all the chair making stuff I've been learning how to do, one of the things I picked up were these laser levels to use as drilling guides. So all I did was take the combination square that I used to set the depth of the bolts into the side legs. I've marked some lines on the side of the side rails here, and now I'm just going to align this laser level to those lines, if I can see them, because walnut can be kind of a pain in the butt when it comes to pencil marks. Okay, so now that we have a line going across here, now when I put the drill back into the hole that we started, we now have a line coming across the drill. So now all I have to do to make sure that this hole is going straight in is keep the laser pointed right across my bit here. So I've got it right on the center of the bit right now, so all I have to do is just keep going forward. The one thing I do have to watch out for is turning this way or that way. I couldn't really find a good way to line the another laser going this way along it, so we're just going to have to kind of eyeball that direction. But if we can at least have the advantage of having one direction kind of giving me a guide, then we should be a little bit better off. And obviously the fun part here is because we're drilling into end grain, it's going to be more challenging, but I am more than happy with how that bolt went in. So now we can put our piece on, figure out where our nut needs to sit, and then install that part of it too. Okay, so I did the exact thing I said I didn't want to do. We're nice and straight coming in this way. As I pull the bolt out, we're perfectly in line with these tenons. So this way, we're just fine. But we are a little bit skewed in that direction, just barely. But it's enough that when you have the leg on, lined up with the tenons, and you put the bolt in, it doesn't go in nicely without some pounding on it, which I preferably would like to not do. So we want to be able to just basically put the bolt in and lock it, and then be able to tighten it down in place. So now this means we have to enlarge one of our holes. And I kind of figured I'd have to do this so that we, in one of these areas we have a little bit of play, because this area is not always going to be perfect, or the hole in here is not always going to be perfect. And so in our side rails here, I don't think we want the bolt to have a lot of play to it. As you can see right now, that is a nice tight fit in there. It's not going to slide around. So I'm thinking that if we just slightly enlarge our hole that's in the leg here, then we'll have that little bit of play in the legs so that this bolt can kind of match the angle that it's going into this board at. That'll help make up for, again, across all of our other legs here, that'll make up for any error we're obviously going to cause. So it looks like I'm going to Home Depot to spend $18 on a 5/8 twist bit because I don't want to use a Forstner bit on this because there's no way to align anything. Like I was saying before, we want to get the hole sizes right before we go through and drill all of our holes. So I should have just listened to myself there. Before drilling all the holes, I should have made sure the sizes were going to work. And so anyway, you might be wondering why I don't want to use a Forstner bit to enlarge the hole, and it's just purely because there's no way to line up a Forstner bit now. Because we have that 1/2 inch hole in there, there's nothing in the center to actually guide the Forstner bit. So if you didn't know how Forstner bits work, that point in the middle is what guides the bit, keeps it from wandering around, while those big wings on the outside actually do the cutting. So if you don't have anything in the middle and you don't secure your piece down, nice and firmly, this bit is just going to walk all over the place. So it's just not an ideal option. If you need to enlarge holes, twist bits are generally the way to go. I do have this 1/2 inch Ryobi bit that I don't care that much about, and it's a pretty cheap bit. So what I might try doing before I have to go drive and spend 18 bucks on a drill bit I'm going to use to clear out 4 holes, I might just take this 1/2 inch one and just do a little bit of swizzly stuff with it to just enlarge that hole just slightly. To just see if that fixes our issue, because again, I don't want to spend money if I don't have to. 18 bucks it's not that much money, but it's a lot of money to spend on a drill bit you're going to use to drill 4 holes, and then you're going to stick it in a drawer and never touch it again. So it's just one of those things. It's not really worth it. If I can make this work, then we'll make it work, but if not, then we'll go shopping. Okay, so bolt now slides in just like we want it to. That's exactly how it should go in. There should be absolutely no friction there. So what I did there is kind of a sin when it comes to drill bits in general. What you never want to do is be cutting with the upper flutes and that of the drill bit. It's not what it's meant for. They are sharp, but that's not what they're there for. And doing that kind of stuff with it will dull your bits fast. That's why I'm not using my good, expensive brad point bit to do that kind of work. I'm using a Ryobi bit that I can replace for, a few bucks. I wouldn't be doing this with a good drill bit. I'm doing it with a Ryobi bit, so it's not a big deal. But all I did to really get it to fit was was in our hole that's in the side rail here. I just went in and just did the same thing of just kind of walking the bit around the edges just to try and slightly enlarge it. So now what's happening in there is that hole is tapering down so that at the front of the bolt, there's a little bit of wiggle room, and then at the very end, it's nice and tight. It's still that nice, perfect 1/2 inch. So now when we put our bolt in, it just slides right in, and everything locks in place. The bolt has no play to it, which is really important. So overall, that is exactly what I want to do everywhere. And that's a lot better than going back in and re-drilling that hole with a 5/8 bit, because again, like I said, it tapers so that your bolt doesn't have any play to it. So now when we slide our bolt in, it's just going to be a perfect fit. So it's a nicely sized fit. So now we're going to flip this board over. And in case you guys are wondering, we are starting with the headboard here, so you're never going to see this area. So if we screw something up really badly, it'll never be seen anyway. So yeah, that's always start in a hidden area. So the nut placement in the rail here is very important because if we put the nut too far out, you're only going to lock into a small amount of threads. If we put the nut too close, we risk hitting this area that's not threaded. So we have to be very careful and measure pretty accurately about where we're going to put this. Now our threaded space here, we got about 1.25 inches of threaded space on each of these bolts. So that's a pretty big target to hit. So all I'm trying to say here is you want to make sure that your nut is not going to be right by the end of the bolt. You want it either kind of in the middle of the threaded area of the bolt or, pretty close to the edge so that you're able to use that nut and, the whole threading and, mechanical advantage that it's going to give you when you're putting the bed together to keep everything nicely lined up. So we can actually just set our nut into an easier place to measure. So we're going to go 1 7/8 in from the shoulder on our tenon here. So we know we have to go in 1 7/8. Then through all the magic of measurements in that, we have to somehow cut a slot that is going to both reach that hole that we have in the middle there so that we can drop this nut in and have it square to everything else. So this part is going to be a nightmare. We only have to do it 4 times because 4 corners. So overall, it's not going to be fun. There's a lot of things that we could mess up on, but it's all hidden on the inside of the bed anyway. Not that big of a deal. If it comes out looking ugly, it is what it is. Okay, so this is another one of those problems that I don't understand. So when I have everything disassembled, I don't have the leg on here, I can put the bolt in, turn it using my, wow, I forgot the word of this thing. This thing, I can use it to turn the bolt, it locks into the nut, everything goes just fine. As soon as I put the leg on here though, I drop the nut in, and I can no longer, no matter what I do, I cannot get this bolt to lock into this nut. No matter what I do here, it just will not bite into the nut. So I cannot figure out what is going on here. I've tried, holding the nut in the air with this little magnetic thing, and it just won't bite into it. So I don't know what's going on. The bolt is in the same place as it was, without the leg on there. So I am completely and utterly stumped at the moment. Like the bolt just will not bite into the nut, no matter how hard I try, how much pressure I apply. And then the annoying thing is when I take it out, you can see that there's no issue with the two of them. They go together just fine. So I've got it all together now. It is about as solid as I could ever imagine anything to be. That is a good connection. It's gonna work perfectly for this whole bed structure. So the issue is that this slot that I cut in here, I did it mostly by chiseling it out. So I cleared it out with the drill bit, then chiseled it out with the mortising chisel. But the nut is sitting at a slight angle, so when you try to bite into it, obviously it's not going to line up. So I need to now that I have an idea of where it needs to be, I need to go back in and kind of either shim it out so it's sitting in there nice and square, or the best solution to this whole thing is to just chamfer the edges of these bolts so that it kind of pulls the nut where it needs to be. Now the best thing to do here would be to use the hollow chisel mortiser, cut a little mortise in there with that thing, it would leave a nice square side roll, everything would come out just about perfectly. Problem is I can't get this thing anywhere near the mortiser, to hopefully line it up, anything like that. So, because it's just too big of a board, too small of a machine, all those number of things. So we have to figure out some way with hand tools to do it cleanly enough to hopefully make this work. So this first one is probably going to be an issue for forever. But again, a bed is not something you're assembling and disassembling every single day. it's really not that big of a deal if it's a little bit of a struggle the first time. So I'm making kind of an executive decision that I'm going to leave this till tomorrow morning because it's pretty late in the day. I only have a little bit of time left in the shop anyway, so I don't think I would get through all 3 legs in the amount of time that I have left. So I want to leave this till tomorrow morning. When I come back in, I have some fresher eyes and I can approach this a little bit more logically, because right now if I go at it, I'm just going to start doing stupid stuff that's going to make things harder to fix later on. So we're just going to leave it. We're going to come back to it tomorrow in the morning. So the one thing I was thinking about this project that's kind of interesting is you could really build this entire thing and most woodworking things with very inexpensive tools. Because at its most basic form, if you look at the way that I've milled, especially these side rails, but all these components, a lot of it is not using, the thousands of dollars in machinery that I have. The table saw, the planer, the jointer, all this stuff, and especially like the drum sander. The drum sander is completely useless in this project, other than maybe those panels later on. But overall, all the expensive machinery that I have is being dwarfed by things like the router, which I'm using all over the place here. Same with the circular saw. I need the circular saw to cut everything to length because a lot of these parts are just too big to cut on the table saw. So for me, I find it very interesting, just the fact that, for just kind of smaller, simpler tools, if you know how to build jigs and you know how to kind of work with those tools and all the different things you can do with them, you can really have a fairly compact shop and you don't really have to spend, tons and tons of money on all the fancy machinery in that. So I will say it definitely helps, like having my bandsaw, having the table saw, having the jointer planer, all those machineries help speed things up. But if you don't have those machines, they really shouldn't limit you in what you can do. Again, things are going to take longer if you don't have the appropriate machinery to do them. But if you enjoy what you're doing, you can always figure out a way to do it. That's one of the best parts about woodworking is you don't need to spend thousands of dollars on stuff. You can do most things with under $1,000 in tools. So one of those things to keep in mind. I know, especially when you're watching videos on YouTube, even with myself, I've got a pretty well set up shop. I know if me from 2 years ago was watching my own videos, I'd be looking at this guy like he's got the whole shop set up. He's got all this amazing machinery and that he could literally do whatever, which is pretty much so the case. And I know from the DMs and the comments that I've gotten from a lot of you guys are just getting into woodworking, just trying to figure out what you need to set up your shop. And so this is one of those really cool projects where I can show you guys that you really don't need much to build cool things. You can work with walnut, you can do all that. You don't need the thousands of dollars of machinery just to build cool stuff. So that's the little rant for the day anyway. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I will see you in the next one.